is to you and me, lad. To be ready.
The Rings of Power definitely took liberties with Tolkien's lore and stories that had already been set in place. Between timeline shifts, new characters, and later in the video there's a whole big thing about Mithril, let's take a look at all the changes and some mistakes in the Rings of Power.
I get funny all over when you talk like that.
Everybody loves Gandalf. He's definitely in your top 5 or 6 favorite wizards, probably behind Dumbledore, Doctor Strange, and probably Glinda or something. However, the Rings of Power supposedly at first seemed a little wizardless. It just doesn't feel right. After all, how can you resist the temptation to throw just a bit more magic into this already magical world? Well, it seems as though the creators of the Rings of Power just couldn't resist. At the end of the first episode, a mysterious meteor can be seen falling from the sky, seemingly predicted by an elder of the Harfoot tribe. Once this meteor made its way to Earth, the middle variety, lying in a crater was a mysterious man. Little was revealed about this man, and he seemed way too cool, with a face that felt like he was seemingly just born out of a space rock at the ripe age of 64. As the series goes on and more is revealed about the bearded meteor man, fans begin to form theories. These theories are seemingly confirmed in the final episode of the series, Alloyed.
Thank you. Let's find out who he is.
It was at this point the Meteor Man was revealed to be one of the Astari, and even further odds are high that it's the most famous one, Gandalf. Which is cool, right? But it's definitely different. According to legend, there were 5 Astari, known in the common tongue as wizards, who were sent to Middle-earth to help fight the forces of Sauron. There's Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast, and the 2 blue ones. But according to lore, these wizards did not arrive in Middle-earth until the Third Age, while the Rings of Power takes place during the Second. So what's with the early entrance of Gandalf? Or on a curveball, maybe this is one of the 2 blue ones. Perhaps they were just too excited to get wizards in the mix, that they decided to retcon history and make it to where the presence of the Astari was not actually recorded until the Third Age, allowing an early crash landing in the Second. The Lord of the Rings was not the only live-action look into the vast world of Middle-earth. The Hobbit trilogy showed us what happened some time before Frodo's fateful journey to Mount Doom. In the Hobbit trilogy, later expanded on by Tolkien himself, we got an in-depth look at a corner of Middle-earth we had not really seen before. That was, of course, the history of dwarves. Well, beyond their dinner cleanup song. We met Thorin Oakenshield, the supposed last in line for the throne as heir to the eldest of the first dwarves, Durin. In the Rings of Power, we meet the Prince of the Dwarves, Durin IV. It was said that the original Durin was meant to live much longer than any other dwarf, which would allow him to rule the dwarven people, later named Durin folk. Their entire culture surrounded this dwarf. It was also said that upon his death, Durin would be reincarnated, with that dwarf holding the right to be king. However, in the Rings of Power, we learn that not only is there a Durin IV, but Durin III is still kicking around as well. The multiple Durins existing at the same time sure puts a head scratcher to the whole reincarnation thing. And sure, maybe that would be retconned, but why would the dwarves of the Third Age still believe it with these 2 living as living proof against it? Definitely seems like a misstep in order to get some dwarf action in this series. Plus, there's the fact that his wife didn't have a beard as promised, but I suppose we can let some things go. The entire Rings of Power series seemed to be culminating the whole time into the creation of the 3 Elven Rings of Power. And while we definitely get to some issues with how that played out, let's start with who should have been there the whole time. Halbrand was revealed in the finale to be Sauron all along, and while his impact on the creation of the rings was important, it was also rather brief. In Tolkien's writings, Sauron disguised as Onatar is actually one of the key voices behind the idea of creating the rings in the first place. It was basically Sauron who gave the elven craftsman Celebrimbor the idea to create such powerful artifacts. However, in the show, it seems Celebrimbor needed little to no outside influence to come up with the project. Sauron is depicted as being late to the game, and while he does have influence over their creation, it's definitely not as much as we were originally told. The outcome is still the same, but the creation of the 3 Rings of Power was definitely an unexpected journey. See what I did there? In the Fellowship of the Ring, we are introduced to Galadriel's husband, Celeborn. A major plotline of the show that will likely carry over into Season 2 is the fact that Galadriel's beloved husband is missing. I think you know where this is going, but yeah, that never happened. There is no reference to the disappearance and presumed demise of the elf Celeborn. The closest possible match to this case is perhaps the time Galadriel and Celeborn were separated during the Second Age. Galadriel had to pass through Khazad-dûm, a place where Celeborn refused to follow. This left the 2 separated from each other, but Galadriel would have had no reason to believe that this meant her husband was dead. Perhaps the Celeborn is missing piece of the show was just a way to add in a little extra mystery and excitement. Perhaps one of the most well-respected beings in all of Middle-earth is the elf Galadriel. She is often depicted as the wisest and most graceful elf whom all beings have a level of respect towards. J.R.R. Tolkien even revealed in the Silmarillion that the Lady Galadriel was one of the only beings in all of Middle-earth that Sauron actually feared. However, that was rather vague, don't you think? I think anyone would probably assume that her going all beautiful and terrible as the dawn on us would be enough alone to strike fear into anyone whom she comes across. I think we all always assumed that it was simply her powerful elven magic and her unwavering wisdom that made her feared, but one of the things the Rings of Power showed us was that perhaps Sauron equally feared her skills with a sword. Just because Galadriel was never previously depicted as a warrior doesn't mean that the change wasn't a welcome one. This is really the first time that Galadriel proved that not only could she enter the minds of her opponents and ward off evil spirits with a silver tongue, but that putting a blade in her hand likely spells doom for anyone who opposes her. This is definitely a welcome change, unlike the complete retconning of Mithril, which, don't worry, we will definitely get to. In the first episode of the series, we're introduced to Galadriel's brother Finrod, and then pretty quickly unintroduced to him. Finrod was killed by Sauron, but the means of the story being revealed in basically the opening narration have definitely taken some liberties that honestly makes it a little better. According to what we knew about Finrod, he never actually swore an oath to find and destroy Sauron. Also, when he did eventually find him, he wasn't exactly hiding. Regardless, his fate was the same, but his newly invented mission was something that added another layer to the Rings of Power. The show added in the idea of Finrod swearing his own oath to find and defeat Sauron, a mission that he did not accomplish. In the show, beyond the idea of revenge for her lost brother, it was partially picking up his new oath that saw Galadriel set out on her quest to face Sauron herself. Hey, nothing wrong with a little extra motivation. In the Rings of Power, we meet Gil-galad, the Elven High King of the Noldor. There are some major differences between the show and the books in terms of this guy's job description. Essentially, the show gives way more power to Gil-galad than he ever had in the books. He is seen being able to grant passage to Valinor, a power traditionally limited to the Valar themselves. He is also depicted as basically being able to order anyone around with pointy ears. Erendir is even seen acting under Gil-galad's orders, but he is not a member of the Noldor. He instead is a Sylvan elf of Tir-Harad. Essentially, the show gave Gil-galad much more power and authority than he should have. One artifact that appeared in the Lord of the Rings trilogy that definitely needed a lot more backstory afterwards was the Palantiri. Better known as the Lost Seeing Stones, these powerful artifacts definitely behave differently in the show than they have previously. In The Return of the King, we see Sauron use a Palantir as a vessel to peer through space and find Pippin. The stones have also been used to peer through time, but only in one direction. We were to believe that the Palantiri could only see in the past, but in the show, Galadriel and Miriel use the Palantir to have a vision of the future downfall of Numenor. These stones are starting to seem like the ultimate plot device. In 8 episodes, The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power managed to make an already vast world that much more expansive and rich with lore. Some mysteries were uncovered, some previously known events occurred right before our very eyes, but as with many adaptations, some of it just didn't make sense. Elendil is the father of Isildur, better known as the guy who royally blew it. Elendil was the original wielder of Narsil, the sword that cut the ring from Sauron's hand. In the show, Pharazôn introduces Elendil, but with an odd lack of recollection that according to the source material he should definitely have. Pharazôn has some vague recollection that Elendil comes from a noble bloodline, but beyond that he seems clueless. Pharazôn should know just about everything about Elendil, given that he was friends with Elendil's father, and the family served as counselors to the king of Numenor. The show is definitely setting up Elendil as someone who needs to rise to power, but according to what we thought we knew, he should basically already be there. Everyone knows the story. And yes, I do mean everyone. My grandma won't stop talking about the forging of the Elven Rings. 7 rings for the dwarves, 9 for the race of men, and 3 for the elves. However, the way you thought it went down? Yeah, throw that right out the window. There are several things about the depiction of the rings forging that differ from the previously believed lore outlined by J.R.R. Tolkien himself. First off, the timeline is off. We were told that the 3 rings of power forged by the elves were the last of the rings to be forged prior to the creation of the One Ring. In the show, however, they are depicted as the first. Another extremely important distinction is the fact that the 3 rings in the show are all forged using Mithril, versus just 1 in the source material. And that is only the beginning. Prior to the Rings of Power, Mithril was believed to be as light as a feather, nearly impenetrable material, perfect for armor, and the material that make up Bilbo and Frodo's vest. However, the Rings of Power just blew the door wide open open. According to the show, the precious metal also has Valinorian light healing properties. This is definitely new. Also, while Mithril is rare, it is found in more places than just Khazad-dûm, and definitely not from multiple lightning-struck Silmaril trees. Overall, one of the most precious materials in Middle-earth lore that now is the foundation of the literal Rings of Power, just found out it was adopted and its whole life was a lie. The Rings of Power is likely not done with its stretching of lore and liberty taking for the sake of storytelling. I just hope if this trend keeps up in Season 2, they at least give Gandalf the power to fly or something.
Now we know you've already checked on these accounts, so the wheels are turning.